Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. We have a great show in store for you. Ian Bremmer, the savvy, sassy, insightful political commentator, is with us. Ian is president and founder of the highly respected risk consultancy, Eurasia Group, as well as GZERO Media. He is also the popular host of GZERO World, which people can see on public television. Ian has been identified with the top 10 global risks this year in a hefty report and a thought-provoking article in Time magazine. And heading the list is not the Middle East on the brink or Ukraine facing partition. It is not the threats endemic in AI, and it's not Russia, the ever-rising price of oil, or the uncertainties in the China economy either. You guessed it, with the presidential election looming on the horizon, it's the internal political challenges we face here at home. We're pleased to welcome Ian Bremmer to the program.
Good to see you, Jim.
Well, it's good to see you. Well, we had some momentous events over the weekend, Iran and Israel. What's your take on it? Who won, who lost?
Well, my hope is that after a week now of significant and very dangerous escalation, we are now, at least for the near term, in a de-escalatory period. In other words, that the Iranians, they really wanted to show a spectacular military strike, but at the same time, they did an awful lot to try to minimize the likelihood that there would be further engagement directly with Israel or, God forbid, with the United States. And I say that in part because they proactively let it be known to the Americans through Iraq and through Turkey that they were going to make these strikes and when they were going to make these strikes, which in turn allowed the Americans, who really want to restrain Israel right now, at least offensively, to send the CENTCOM commander over to Israel to talk about ironclad guarantees for Israeli defense and to get, sort of ships and aircraft in position to help the Israelis defend themselves, which of course they were able to in pretty extraordinary fashion over the weekend. So yeah, 300 missiles and drones against Israel is unprecedented by Iran. It's a big deal. But whatever the Israelis do next, I do expect that it's going to be ratcheted down in the context of both those strikes and the Israeli strikes that precipitated all of this, assassinating a senior Iranian leader in Damascus just over a week ago.
So they practically took an ad in the Jerusalem Post to announce the attack. What was the point of telegraphing a punch? I thought in military affairs there's the element of surprise.
Well, I mean, I could ask, what was the point of the Americans doing the exact same thing a couple of months ago? It was the end of January, you'll remember, when there were 3 American servicemen and women that were killed by an Iranian proxy in Jordan on the border with Syria. And the United States did not respond immediately. They waited for a week. And while they were waiting, they were delivering messages through third parties, including Iraq, by the way, and Turkey, to Iran to help them know that this was very serious, that if there were any further attacks, that there'd be strikes directly on Iran, but that this time around, the U.S. was going to hit the proxies, which allowed the Iranians, why would the Americans take out an ad like that? It allowed the Iranians to get their own troops and military advisors out so that you could contain, you could better calibrate the escalation. You want to show that it's serious. You want to reestablish deterrence, but the United States and Iran both really don't want to see a broader war, certainly not involving each of them directly against the other. That is what is motivating this behavior. And certainly the Iranians were very conscious of the American playbook from January, February, when they were thinking about how they were going to respond to this failure of their own ability to defend a senior Iranian leader against an Israeli strike.
Well, is this the new intelligence, Bill Burns, and telegraphing that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine before they did it?
I mean, I think that was one of the more effective things the Americans were doing. They knew that they had a lot of understanding, tactical understanding from what the Russians were up to, including some, what would you call them, false flag attacks, at least a couple of which they were able to stop from happening by embarrassing the Russians and putting it out publicly. Now, of course, they weren't able to prevent the Russians from invading Ukraine, despite significant efforts to doing so. They knew that the Russians, that Putin himself, lying directly to the face of French President Macron, of German Chancellor Scholz, saying we have absolutely no intention of invading. And the Americans saying, no, we have you read to rights. We know exactly what you're doing. We see the plans. We're telling you, don't do this. There will be major consequences. And Putin refused to listen. But certainly that is seen to be a significant arrow in the quiver of military statecraft by the Americans today.
Well, it's very interesting. I'm intrigued with the timing of the attack. Napoleon said, never attack your enemy when your enemy's making a mistake. Why do you think Iran decided to do this now?
Well, again, I think that they felt you've got an 84-year-old supreme leader who is believed to have advanced prostate cancer. You have a level of instability on the ground in Iran, and then they have the Israelis engaging in a successful, pretty spectacular attack in Syria, taking out Iran's top military advisor to the Syrians, to the Syrian proxies, the Shia militants that are there. And I think that the Iranians felt like that could not go unanswered. So that is absolutely the timing. And, you know, while the missiles were flying, while the drones were flying, before they were intercepted, before they hit their targets, you had the Iranian mission to the UN saying, this is a retaliation for that attack. We now consider this matter closed. That was the intention. I mean, again, at every step here, there was an overwhelming effort by the Iranians, not saying it was fully successful, but this is what they were trying to do, trying to tell the world, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And that I think describes their intentions.
Okay, so 300 drones and rockets, probably a 99% kill rate, at least that's what the IDF said.
Yep.
Is Iran significantly weakened? Have they impaired their capacity to do it again?
They didn't send hypersonics. A lot of people believe they have them. Again, they didn't do this as a sneak attack. They didn't just send ballistic missiles. They sent the drones first. I mean, do I believe that Iran thought that some of their weapons would have gotten through? All of the targeting was military. They weren't targeting civilian centers at all. The Americans have said that publicly. So yeah, I suspect, look, I'm obviously not privy to the decision-making of the Iranian military here, but I suspect they thought that they were going to have some more success against Israeli targets on the ground, but not massive success. I mean, it is very clear the Iranians were not trying to bloody the Israelis. They were not trying to force the Israelis into a defensive crouch. They weren't trying to embarrass them and force them to lash out against Iran. Absolutely not. So between, you know, no damage, really there wasn't a single significant casualty. There were only light injuries here we're talking about. So, I mean, truly, this was the best possible outcome for Israel when you're facing 300 plus drones and missiles. Would the Iranians have wanted a bit more than that to show their capabilities? Yeah, I think probably. We'll never know. You and I will never know. But not dramatically more. I think this outcome is within the range of what would have been considered quite plausible and acceptable by Iranian leaders.
So prior to the attack, Bibi Netanyahu's political fortunes seemed to be at a very low ebb. Yep. Do you believe this outcome strengthened his hand?
Yes, I do. I think that leading the country at a time that you can show that the Israelis stand up and have no damage when the Iranians are attacking you, especially after the failures of October 7th, when the government took their eye off the ball, the Israeli Defense Forces had been largely taken out of defending against the border in Gaza, brought to the West Bank. and the spectacular and horrific terrorist attacks against Israel. I mean, that was the legacy for Netanyahu, the most important legacy. And now he can say that, look what we were able to accomplish against our biggest ally, biggest adversary, our biggest enemy, our most potent enemy in the region. I think that helps him. I think it helps him that he was providing that security with strong support from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Jordan, and we're even hearing from Saudi Arabia. That's a big deal. And now the problem for the United States, who has no love for this prime minister, certainly Biden does not, the president does not, is that this makes it much harder to take Netanyahu out through democratic means on the ground. And if you're thinking about the future of the Middle East and the impact of that on the U.S. political spectrum, what you're going to see is much more likely that he's still there come November. And much more likely the war in Gaza is still going on. And the focus now is Iran. You and I are talking about, you haven't brought up Gaza yet, but there's still a war going on. And the Israelis still intend a ground assault on Rafah with over 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering there. And with all of the Palestinian casualties, civilian casualties that we've already seen, all of this is a real problem for Biden. I think that the U.S. handled this quite well over the last week, but more broadly, the United States is in no man's land in the Middle East right now, and Israeli governance is not helping them.
So I guess the question on everyone's mind is what's going to happen next? And is Israel going to attack Iran directly? Is Israel going to go into Rafah? Is this going to be escalatory? And will the outcome affect Joe Biden's political fortunes? If he's able to calm things down, I would think it would increase his popularity if there is an escalation.
So you asked three questions there. I'll answer
problem.
them sequentially and briefly. The first is that we are now, I think, in a de-escalatory cycle in the sense that the Israeli response will be significantly less than the attack they had on Damascus, killing the senior Iranian military official. I'd be very surprised if we saw anything from Israel that was close to that. That implies that we are de-escalating for now. But longer term, there's no deterrence between Israel and Iran. The Iranians are still going to provide weapons for all of their proxies and intelligence. This is a group, the Axis of Resistance, that believes that Israel does not have a right to exist. And the Israelis will still target Iranians on the ground in those countries, operating with those actors. And the Iranians have already showed that if that happens, there's going to be hell to pay. They're not going to have the same willingness to restrain and to telegraph their actions the way they just did over the past week. So I think that the situation is getting more dangerous. I think the likelihood that the war goes on in Gaza is going up. I think it's getting harder to get a near-term resolution on Hamas breakthrough of negotiations for a temporary ceasefire and some hostage release. All of that is problematic for Biden going forward. So overall, I think this is a serious negative. It's not as negative as, say, the immigration, the border issue. But it's a real problem, especially with oil at $90 right now. This is the piece of inflation that is most problematic in the way Americans vote. It's gas prices, because you see gas prices. You fill up your car on a regular basis, and you do it by itself. So you know exactly what that costs now. You know what it cost a month ago, what it cost 6 months ago. And unfortunately, the geopolitics around energy prices right now, that premium is going up.
So let's turn to the presidential election.
Yeah.
Traditionally, foreign policy has not played a major role in any presidential election. It's a general proposition. But we have certainly a heated up world situation right now. We have the economic situation, price of oil escalating, inflation up. We have, so the economic issues. You have Trump standing trial in New York on 34 felony counts. What do you see in this mix as to how the presidential election is going to play out, particularly where you categorized its uncertainty as the number one threat? facing us in 2024.
Yeah, I consider the crisis that U.S. democracy is presently facing to be the largest risk in 2024. The way we categorize these is likelihood, imminence, and impact. And the latter, of course, is weighing heavily in that decision here because the U.S. is by far the most powerful country in the world. And what happens in the U.S. has ripple effects and implications for everybody, for allies and for adversaries. So, I mean, obviously, if the same exact situation was playing out in Canada's democracy, and it's not, it wouldn't be number one. But there you have it. Now, this election, you rightly say that, elections in the United States are, not usually about foreign policy. They're usually about the economy. Now, that's a recent development. That's been true since like 1978. Interestingly, when the polls started for how Americans are voting in a systematic way, it was after World War II. And from 1948, the first time we saw those polls, until the 70s, national security was the dominant theme. Now, maybe not a surprise after World War II, but right up through Vietnam. And then it stopped. And then the focus was the economy. And the real question is that changing right now? I mean, I don't know that I would describe foreign policy as the most important issue exercising U.S. voters, but I might describe it as national security, broadly speaking. I mean, for many voters, they describe the border security and immigration as the number one issue for them. And if you add to that issues like the state of U.S. democracy, which means very different things if you support Biden or if you support Trump, but nonetheless, everyone's concerned about it. They just think that the other side is the one that's destroying U.S. democracy. And then you add impact on the Middle East war, and a lot of Democrats that are increasingly supportive of the Palestinian position, a majority of Democrats actually saying they view it that way and really undermining Biden. You put those things together and compare it to the way the Americans view the economy through a much more tribal and politicized lens, then this election looks a lot more complicated. It doesn't look like the economy is driving the election. It looks like a lot of things are driving the election, and national security writ large is a critical component of that. Keep in mind, Jim, that the way you view the economy is so politicized. I mean, most Americans that are supporting the guy in power think the economy is doing well. Most Americans that don't think the economy is doing badly. Those groups had very different views of the economy. Same groups, very different view of the economy before Biden became president. So the principal attribute that determines how you feel about the economy is who you vote for, which doesn't make an awful lot of sense if you think about the economy from an analytic perspective, but it's about how you feel about the future of your country and whether or not, the country is going to do well. Suddenly, it might make a little more sense.
Well, what do you have to say about the role of disinformation in the campaign? We see the lowest unemployment in the last 50 years, the crime rate down, immigration is under better control than it was in the Trump administration. But yet you ask the man in the street and he says, we have the worst economy ever. We have our cities are a cesspool of violence, even though the crime rate is down. And Biden has failed completely in controlling the border. So do facts count, or is it all some kind of Orwellian denial of the truth?
I mean, when Americans fundamentally disagree on something really basic, like, is American democracy at threat? And Democrats that support Biden will say yes, and Trump is the sole reason why democracy is at threat. He is trying to destroy the democracy. Look at the insurrection on January 6th. Look at his efforts to overturn the election. Look at what he has done ever since. This man is a threat. He will become a dictator. And then you look at Republicans who overwhelmingly support Trump, and they say, no, Biden is a threat, a fundamental threat to democracy. And look at how this democracy has been eroded and destroyed by the deep state. Now, you and I can say that we agree much more with one or the other of those perspectives because of the facts. And I certainly believe that the facts are closer to portraying Trump as a threat to democracy. But I would also say that there are a lot of things that Democrats have done, like, for example, this New York case that you already mentioned, which have brought a whole bunch of misdemeanors to a felony that never would have happened against any other citizen, that makes a whole bunch of people that are supporting Trump say, look at what these guys are doing to rule the law. Look how they're weaponizing it against our guy. And so there's just enough fact out there to allow people that are only consuming media and social media algorithmically from people that they agree with or from people that they hate with the intention of hating them, there's no overlap. There's very little space to have a long-form conversation like you're having now with me on your show, like I have on my show, where we can have a broader discussion about just the issues. It's a great thing to do, but it's not the way a majority of Americans, especially young Americans, consume their news. And that's a very, very serious problem. I think that if you can't agree in a country on basic facts that are essential to how that country governs, that's the beginning of the end of your democracy. And the Americans are on that path presently.
Let's just move on to another subject that you cover in your threat assessment, AI. Is AI a threat or a promise?
I think it's much more of a promise in the sense that it is transformative of every sector in the global economy. It is allowing people to better measure the data that they have, the operations that they engage in, increase productivity of existing workers and of their firms, reduce waste. And it's not just one or two CEOs. Every CEO I know recognizes this is something they need to lean into. Now, usually when you have a transformative and disruptive technology like that, you'll have a whole bunch of people that are very powerful that say, I need to stop that. It's going to kill my industry. I mean, think about, moving to electric vehicles, and if you're not in EVs, or moving to solar and wind and nuclear, but if you're coal, you say, I got to stop that. Well, I mean, AI, we have a much more transformative technology that no one's trying to stop. Everyone is actually investing into it. It's trying to make it happen. So I'm very excited about the transformational potential of AI to create a new wave of globalization. But even though that's my immediate response, obviously, there are lots of ways that this technology can and will be used to disrupt in negative ways. I mean, anything you can use. I mean, I can code in Python now because I've got access to apps that will do that for me, and I can instruct it. But that also means that I could become a cyber hacker if I wanted to. Now, I couldn't do that a year ago. Now, Jim, I'll tell you, it's not a hobby of mine, but it's an avocation for a lot of other people out there. And we need to be worried about what that means for the creation of new weapons, including disinformation. It's a very big danger that comes at the same time as all of this economic growth.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Ian Bremmer, because we've come to a close. And the question is, you're in the threat business. Biden called Trump America's greatest threat. Would you agree with that?
No. I think that America's greatest threat is much deeper than any individual. I think that Trump is a symptom of challenges in the United States that have been growing for decades now. I think that increasingly a large number of Americans believe that their political leaders and institutions no longer are legitimate, no longer represent them. And this is something that we can focus on: globalization and how you hollowed out a lot of the well-being and welfare for average workers in the U.S. as their jobs went outside the U.S. You can focus on automation and robotics. You can talk about identity politics and the inability to effectively manage immigration in a way that everyone saw the U.S. was still a melting pot that celebrated people coming together as Americans. And then finally, and most toxically, the algorithms, the social media, the polarization of the information space. I think those are the greatest threat to the United States, not any individual. I mean, if Trump loses or if Trump suddenly died of a heart attack, someone's going to replace him because there is demand for that kind of a leader, somebody that tells you, I'm going to break the existing system because I know that it doesn't reflect your interests. We're going to stop these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're going to stop all of the support for a small number of people that are benefiting and profiting off of your back. And we're going to stop taking American capital into China. And you and I may disagree with that. And Lord knows we've benefited from a lot of it, but a lot of Americans have not. And I'm deeply sympathetic to why a lot of Americans are not. And, you know, Steve Bannon referred to Trump as an imperfect vessel, which is perhaps the understatement of the century. But nonetheless, he was on to something very, very clear, which is this is not about Trump. You have that level of demand and that level of people that are really, really angry for reasons that are justified, that their system no longer represents them. You're going to continue to see people replace Trump in that role.
Okay, so we have to wrap up. Thank you for coming by, Ian Bremmer. This has just been marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best.